Throughout my long life, in the quiet seclusion of my study in Küsnacht and within the walls of my clinic, I have observed a profound paradox that haunts the human mind. It is a subtle tragedy. Those who possess the greatest capacity to care are often the very ones who lose themselves inside the suffering of others. You may believe that it is only the unexamined life that leads to such confusion. Yet, in my experience, the opposite is frequently true. The more you cultivate psychological awareness, the more another person's pain registers in your own nervous system as though it were your own. The deeper you venture into your own inner landscape, the more you begin to feel personally responsible for fates that were never yours to govern. What begins as a noble capacity for empathy subtly transforms into something far more intricate, far more tangled, and far less conscious. Consider what this dynamic actually produces in your daily life. Someone you love is engulfed in a crisis, and you find yourself expending more energy dissecting their situation than they do. In the dead of night, while they sleep, you replay their conversations in your mind, seeking a solution. When they make a choice that you foresee will bring them harm, something deep within you constricts, not merely with warm concern, but with a sudden, urgent dread that feels almost like a personal threat. And when they remain stuck, when they make the same agonizing error once more, you experience their stagnation as a quiet, devastating failure. Your own failure. Decades ago, I found it necessary to borrow a phrase from the anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl to describe this psychological state: participation mystique. It denotes a condition of psychic fusion, a primitive state of identity where two distinct individuals collapse into a unified dynamic, and the boundary between your inner world and theirs simply dissolves. I observed this repeatedly in my patients. I recognized its perilous pull within my fellow analysts, and I found myself forced to be unsparing about what it truly reveals. It is not love in its highest form. It is something far older, far more archaic, and far less conscious than love, a deep, unacknowledged need wearing the gentle face of devotion. What we must explore together may provoke a quiet discomfort within you. This is not because it calls into question the genuine warmth of your heart, but because it shines a light upon what you have actually been doing with that care, what that compulsion has been protecting, and what you have consistently refused to confront within yourself. By maintaining your focus on the salvation of another, you have engaged in an ancient psychological mechanism thousands of times without consciously registering it. Someone close to you is suffering, and a reaction, swift, automatic, older than any conscious deliberation, moves you toward them. But you do not move merely to stand beside them as an empathetic witness. You move into them. You do not observe their pain from an objective distance. You absorb it into your own tissue. Their crisis migrates across the invisible threshold between your lives and settles heavily within your own chest, demanding a resolution. Most individuals misinterpret this absorption. They take pride in it, viewing it as definitive proof of emotional depth, of love, of psychological sophistication. For a brief time, perhaps it is. But there comes a precise moment where the nature of the engagement shifts, a crossing that most people fail to notice as it occurs. When I brought participation mystique into the field of analytical psychology, I was careful to emphasize that this is not merely a severe pathology of the fragile mind. Rather, it represents an archaic level of psychological organization, a primitive state of psychic fluidity that any human being can regress into when subjected to the weight of intense emotional proximity. In my clinical work, I was always explicit about the hidden cost of this fusion. An analyst who becomes psychically fused with their patient does not merely risk their own emotional equilibrium. They forfeit something far more fundamental to the healing relationship, the very separateness that made them useful in the first place. Reflect upon what this means beyond the walls of the consulting room. When you fuse with another person's psychological burden, you cease to be genuinely present to them. Instead, You become present only to a version of them that has been filtered through your own fears, your own urgency, and your own unintegrated inner material. You no longer perceive what their soul actually requires. You merely react to what their suffering activates inside of you. The assistance you offer from this state of fusion is not tailored to their unique path. It is designed to soothe the inner turmoil that their pain has awakened in your own chest. There is a distinct sensation that marks this psychological boundary line. It arrives as a persistent, low-grade anxiety that does not entirely belong to you, a quiet restlessness regarding someone else's destiny that follows you into rooms they have never entered. It awakens you at 3 o'clock in the morning. It causes their silence to feel like an impending catastrophe. You catch yourself spending 20 minutes mentally constructing an argument for a conversation you will never have. You notice that their good news brings you relief rather than genuine joy. Once you learn to recognize this pattern, its presence becomes undeniable. That sensation is not love overflowing its banks. It is the signature of a boundary that has already been erased. What renders participation mystique so deeply insidious for the psychologically minded individual is precisely this. It does not feel like confusion. It feels like supreme clarity. It feels as though you comprehend the other person far more clearly than they comprehend themselves. The absolute conviction you feel regarding what they must do, the path they ought to walk, and the errors they must avoid, that conviction is not objective insight. It is the primary symptom of fusion. It is what psychic entanglement feels like from the inside, carefully cloaked in the sophisticated vocabulary of wisdom. The broader your psychological vocabulary, the more artfully you can mistake your own projection for profound understanding. Yet, if the toll were limited merely to emotional exhaustion, the solution would be simple enough. One would prescribe rest, a temporary retreat to replenish one's reserves. But my observations led me to a conclusion far more unsettling. The essential question is not merely what this energetic leak is costing you. The crucial question is what this intervention is doing to the person you are attempting to save, and what this driving impulse, when examined with absolute candor, reveals about the unhealed wounds you have left behind in your own psyche. It is commonly assumed that projection is an extraordinary event reserved for moments of extreme psychological disturbance, jealousy, paranoia, or unwarranted rage. People rarely consider that projection forms the invisible architecture beneath their most altruistic deeds. In my work, I came to understand projection not as a rare distortion, but as a constant structural feature of the unintegrated psyche. It is the natural mechanism through which contents of our own unconscious elements we have not yet recognized or claimed within ourselves are cast outward into the world, where we encounter them as though they belonged entirely to an external object. In my writings on analytical psychology, I sought to clarify the precise mechanics of this process. A projection cannot simply land anywhere. It attaches itself where there is an existing hook, something in the other person that resonates, however faintly, with an unintegrated element within yourself. This subtle resonance is precisely what gives projection its convincing quality of absolute clarity. It is why it is so difficult to catch in the act. Apply this mechanism to the persistent urge to rescue someone. When you behold a person in distress and feel not merely compassionate concern, but a compelling urgency, a driving imperative to intervene, to fix, to accelerate their development, the question we must ask is not how deeply you care for them. The true question is, what unacknowledged aspect of your own inner journey are you gazing at? The specific nature of that urgency is always diagnostic. The precise manifestation of suffering in another that you find entirely unbearable, the particular defect in their life you feel compelled to rectify, these are never random. They correspond directly to something within your own history that has never been fully traversed, understood, or integrated. Consider the individual in your life whose situation you have found most agonizing to step back from. Ask yourself honestly, Is there a dimension of their struggle that echoes a chapter of your own life that remains unresolved? A fear you never fully faced? A choice you avoided? A buried part of your own potential that is still waiting in the dark? If you are brutally honest with your own soul, the answer is almost invariably yes. In my exploration of the therapeutic process, I formulated a truth regarding the final stage of analytical work, transformation. I observed that an analyst cannot guide a patient a single step further than the analyst has traveled in their own inner development. This principle is as simple as it is uncompromising. One cannot assist another person to advance beyond one's own psychological frontier. This limit exists not due to a lack of technique or warmth, but because the unresolved material within the helper becomes the absolute ceiling of what they can offer. What remains unintegrated within you is never neutral. It actively shapes what you perceive in the other person, and it dictates what you attempt to do with what you see. This implies that your most intense rescue efforts are, in truth, subtle attempts to resolve a personal dilemma at a safe distance. The individual you are most desperate to redeem is carrying, in some form, a mirror of what you most urgently need to understand about yourself. By pouring your vitality into their transformation, you are attempting to resolve through a proxy what can only be confronted within the solitude of your own heart. Their healing becomes an unconscious substitute for your own, and because it can never truly perform that function, your internal urgency never permanently subsides. You navigate them through one crisis, only to find yourself unconsciously anticipating the next, because the underlying wound you are seeking to mend was never theirs to heal. We must also examine what this dynamic inflicts upon the recipient of your care. The psychological cost to the person being viewed through the lens of another's unlived life transforms this issue from a psychological dynamic into an ethical concern. There are many ways to interfere with the integrity of a human soul. Suppression and hostility are obvious, but one can compromise another's development just as effectively through intense affection, constant devotion, and the highest intentions. One can still trespass upon a process that was never meant to be touched. The journey of individuation, the natural movement of a human psyche toward its own inherent wholeness, is not a process that can be artificially accelerated from the outside. It cannot be refined by an eager observer, nor can it be gifted from one human being to another through sheer force of will. It is an organic process that unfolds according to its own hidden laws, its own timing, and its own necessary confrontations with dark and difficult realities. It follows an internal compass that the conscious ego rarely comprehends and would often actively resist if it could. The deeper intelligence of the psyche knows precisely what it is doing, even when the conscious mind appears hopelessly lost. When you observe someone you love and feel absolute certainty that you see what they cannot, the repetitive loop they are trapped in, the obvious choice they are evading, you are merely observing the current position of their ego. You are not beholding their complete psyche. You cannot perceive what the unconscious is quietly organizing beneath their apparent stagnation. You cannot know what inner strength that very stagnation is compelling them to build. Throughout my practice, I encountered cases where the most logical, sensible, and obvious advice turned out to be entirely disastrous. This was not because the insight was factually wrong, but because the timing was premature, or because the resistance the patient displayed was not a mere obstacle to be removed, but a necessary defense required for their psychological protection. What appears to an outside observer as a total failure to move forward is frequently the psyche quietly gathering the precise resources required for a profound internal transformation. The psyche possesses its own autonomy. It functions under an intrinsic intelligence that operates independently of our conscious wishes, and entirely independent of what an outside benefactor has decided is best. When you override that autonomy with your persistent interventions, your advice, and your constant anxiety, you do not assist their healing. You merely impose your personal timeline over theirs. You substitute your private vision of their potential for the unique shape their own soul is striving to realize. This is where the infringement remains hidden, even from the one committing it. The impulse does not feel like a desire for control. It feels like unselfish dedication. Yet a dedication that cannot abide the slow, erratic pace of another person's growth. A dedication that grows anxious when they move in an unexpected direction is not true devotion to them. It is devotion to a predetermined outcome you have designed on their behalf. The crucial question is whether you can cultivate the wisdom to distinguish between true psychological presence and psychic occupation. Presence holds space for the other person's inherent nature to do its work. Occupation saturates that space, leaving no room for anything to unfold except what you have already envisioned. Many people, upon hearing that they must cease their attempts to rescue others, mistake this insight for a call to cold indifference. They assume I am advising them to harden their hearts, to withdraw behind walls of detachment, and to cultivate apathy. But such an interpretation misses the entire weight of what I have spent my life seeking to understand. It merely trades one psychological posture for its opposite shadow. The true distinction is not between caring and not caring. It is the profound difference between two entirely different ways of being present with another human soul, one that serves their genuine development and one that quietly usurps it. A helper who has not confronted their own unconscious material does not cease to affect the person before them. They affect them invisibly, pouring their own unintegrated anxiety into the dynamic. The assistance they offer becomes contaminated by their own need to be needed. To witness another human being is a demanding psychological task. The true witness holds space without occupying it. They remain a separate, bounded, and distinct individual. It is precisely this clear separateness that renders them truly useful. Another person can only truly discover themselves, can only confront their own shadow and take responsibility for their own life when they are met by someone who remains authentically other. When you dissolve into their process, when your inner state becomes entirely dependent on their daily triumphs or failures, you rob them of that essential encounter. You become a mirror held so close to their face that it can reflect nothing at all. Occupying another's process possesses a distinct emotional texture. It manifests as a restless urgency that refuses to settle even when circumstances improve. It reveals itself in a feeling of relief at their progress that is strangely excessive, because their progress was required to soothe your anxiety. The act of witnessing requires something far more difficult. It requires you to sit quietly with another person's suffering without rushing to extinguish it. It demands that you trust a process whose outcome you cannot control and whose ultimate end you cannot see. It requires you to remain steadfastly present to someone who may be moving through their darkness at a pace that frustrates your ego, without allowing your quiet presence to sour into abandonment or passivity. It demands that you possess a sufficiently defined sense of self, that you have done enough of your own inner work, that their unresolved personal turmoil does not immediately ignite yours. This is not emotional hardness, it is psychological discipline. It requires far greater maturity than intervention, for intervention provides the ego with something busy to do. The witness has nothing to do but everything to be. Here lies the fundamental paradox. The exact moment you cease your desperate attempts to save another person is frequently the precise moment you become genuinely capable of being of service to them. Not because you have abandoned your love, but because you have finally reclaimed enough psychological distance to perceive them clearly as an autonomous individual possessing their own path, their own timing, and an intrinsic wisdom that was always far more capable than your anxiety allowed you to believe. When you cease this unconscious drive, the immediate result is rarely a sense of peaceful resolution. The immediate result is profound discomfort. It begins as a strange, persistent restlessness that arises when a deeply ingrained habit is suddenly interrupted. The old impulse returns with force. You find yourself reaching to check on them, mentally drafting messages of advice, analyzing their choices once more. The instinctive layer of the mind does not yet realize the rules have changed, and it moves toward its familiar patterns. Yet, if you possess the fortitude to sit quietly within that discomfort without acting upon it, something extraordinary begins to emerge. When the psychological fusion dissolves and two distinct individuals are once again present in the room, there emerges what I can only call the possibility of genuine contact. You cannot truly meet a person with whom you are psychically merged. You can only manage them, be managed by them, or swing wildly between those two poles. When you cease carrying the weight of another's destiny, you become vastly more present to them, not less. You are no longer interacting with a projection crafted from your own fears and unfulfilled hopes. You are standing with them as they actually are, precisely where they are, moving at the exact pace their own nature demands. Only from this posture of clarity can your presence offer real strength. Then comes the second stage of this realization, which is often far more difficult to endure. When the projection is withdrawn, when you pull back the psychic energy you had cast onto the struggles of another, that energy does not simply vanish. It returns to its source. It returns to your own interior life. The grief you were attempting to heal at a distance through someone else must now be felt within your own heart. The deep existential anxiety you were outrunning by managing their crisis no longer has an external outlet. The unlived aspects of your own life that you were trying to complete through a proxy now stand directly before you, silently demanding your attention. This is not a punishment. It is the essential task of individuation. The withdrawal of projection is the true beginning of inner work. Both individuals in the relationship are finally granted what is genuinely theirs. You receive your own life back, with all its unfinished tasks and quiet possibilities, and they are granted the dignity of their own process, unoccupied, unmanaged, moving at the precise cadence their own soul requires. Eventually, a quiet realization takes hold. The version of the person you were so desperately trying to save was, in part, a creation of your own mind. They were a figure shaped as much by your internal needs as by their own reality. When this illusion clears, the energy that was once bound up in another's destiny returns to its true origin. It confronts you with the questions you have systematically postponed, the choices you have hesitated to make, the quiet aching in your own life that you made bearable by remaining indispensable to someone else. In my medical writings, I observed that a physician cannot permanently evade their own inner difficulties by endlessly treating the difficulties of others. Compulsive rescue work is often a sophisticated form of self-evasion. The task being avoided is always uniquely yours, waiting with the timeless patience of the unconscious mind, which never relinquishes its demand for internal wholeness. People often fear that if they cease organizing their existence around the needs of others, they will encounter only emptiness, that they will lose all sense of purpose and meaning. But that fear is simply the voice of the complex itself, attempting to convince you that your existence is valid only when you are serving a utility. It is the clearest sign that you have not yet truly met yourself. What awaits you on the other side of this transition is authentic presence. It is the capacity of a human being who possesses a clear self to show up fully to life, who can sit alongside another's suffering without absorbing it, who can accompany them through their valley without attempting to direct their steps, and who can love deeply without allowing that love to degenerate into a subtle form of control. The individual who emerges from this process is not colder, nor have they grown distant. They have simply become honest. They are capable of a relationship that does not require the other person to remain broken in order for them to feel necessary. They can witness another's transformation without needing to claim credit for it. They can hold a space open without feeling a compulsion to fill it. And they have finally begun, with no proxies and no diversions, the quiet, painstaking, and essential work of their own individuation. It is a path that offers no grand dramatic moments. It begins when you choose to sit quietly with your own discomfort, declining to reach for someone else's life to make your own bearable. It is the opening of an enduring dialogue within your own soul, one that only you can conduct, and one from which no one else can save you.